on a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates. That lab in Wuhan, China, run by a doctor known as the Batwoman. The Trump administration now claims there is evidence this is where the coronavirus got loose.
I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
What is the evidence? Or is it an effort by the Trump administration to shift the blame to China? We're joined by the CIA's former station chief in Beijing. Plus, your pets and COVID-19, and the case of a dog named Winston who became infected by his human owners.
His signs were that he lost his appetite for a few days and then made a little gagging noise.
Plus, your questions about COVID-19 and the law, your job, your home, your rights.
We'd like to know what rights we have.
What do you suggest we do?
From the Law and Crime Network, this is a special COVID-19 edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Ross, and this is a special report for the Law and Crime Network and for our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. I'm joined today by my colleague at Law and Crime, executive producer Rhonda Schwartz. And Rhonda, we're going to begin with talk about that lab in China and the solid allegations being made by the Trump administration. They say they're solid, at least, of that's the place where the whole thing started.
That's right, Brian. There's been a lot of confusion, a lot of conflicting information, but everyone is wondering, did the virus come from that lab in China? A lot of talk about that over the last few days.
Absolutely. Here's what President Trump had to say in an appearance on Fox News over the weekend.
Are you suggesting that maybe you have some evidence that this was not a naturally occurring virus?
We're going to see what it is. You're talking about the virus and where it came from?
Yeah.
No, we're going to see where it is. We're going to see where it comes from. And, look, you know every theory. You had the theory from the lab. You had the theory from many different, the bats and the type of bat. And the bat is 40 miles away, so it couldn't have been here and it couldn't have been there. And there's a lot of theories. But, yeah, we have people looking at it very, very strongly.
We're going to be given a very strong report as to exactly what we think happened. And I think it'll be very conclusive.
Is there any suggestion that it was anything nefarious or that it was just a mistake?
So I think they made a horrible mistake, and they didn't want to admit it. We wanted to go in. They didn't want us there. Even World Health wanted to go in. They were admitted, but much later, not immediately. And my opinion is they made a mistake. They tried to cover it. They tried to put it out. It's like a fire. It's really like trying to put out a fire. They couldn't put out the fire.
And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was even stronger in saying there is solid evidence of all this.
There's enormous evidence that that's where this began. We've said from the beginning that this was a virus that originated in Wuhan, China. We took a lot of grief for that from the outset, but I think the whole world can see now. Remember, China has a history of infecting the world, and they have a history of running substandard laboratories. These are not the first times that we've had a world exposed to viruses as a result of failures in a Chinese lab. And so while the intelligence community continues to do its work, they should continue to do that and verify so that we are certain. I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
But whatever that evidence is, it has not yet been presented. And Rhonda, there are some people who dispute the claims from the Trump administration.
Exactly. And Dr. Fauci gave a new interview to National Geographic and said flatly, this virus did not come from a laboratory, was not a man-made occurrence. So we have a lot of conflicting statements from high officials about this.
Right. And the Office of the Director of National Intelligence has also indicated it was not man-made, but did not specify whether it might have come out of that lab by accident. So to find out more about this, we're joined by a very special guest, Randy Phillips, the former CIA country chief in China, now with the Minsk Group, a senior partner for the Asia aspect of that Minsk Group. And Randy, thanks for joining us. What is your take on this?
Well, thank you, Brian. I think there's several different ways to look at this, and just watching your opening clip, I think kind of put this in stark relief. The easiest thing, I think, to rule out from what we're seeing by the evidence and from the statement from the DNI last week and Dr. Fauci last night is that there seems to be no evidence that anybody has brought forward to say that this is man-made or artificially manipulated. So if you put that aside, then the question becomes, based on the evidence, there's no doubt there was a lot that came out in and around that wet market, and the science says that it has evolved from nature. Now, it's either something that happened at that wet market or a similar place where it jumped from bats to a carrier to humans, or we do know that at that lab in Wuhan, they were conducting tests for years, some of it at the behest, or at least the partial support of the CDC, on exactly these kind of coronaviruses. I think the one statement from one scientific source had it as a 96.2% match to what we're seeing in the current coronavirus. So those are the two areas that I think need to be run to ground to see what we learn. And you got the scientific track going on, and you have the intelligence track going on. And hopefully those two converge and we get to a bottom line.
And let me ask you, what's the reputation of that lab in terms of its safety precautions?
Well, it's had its issues. There was enough publicity put out there about a U.S. Embassy Beijing trip there in 2018 to take a look at that lab as part of its general reporting on China's scientific research, and had written back to the State Department, and this has been made public since then, of some of the flaws in security practices and safety practices at that lab. That lab is also very much in the center of Wuhan. I think it's about 9 miles away from the wet market in question. And so there have been concerns on that lab, just like there have been on other labs, as Secretary Pompeo said in your opening statement.
Randy, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda?
As a former intelligence official, when you have the politician saying one thing and the doctor saying another, and then the head of national intelligence saying something else, what's really going on behind the scenes? How do you sort that out?
Well, Rhonda, I appreciate that question. If it were any other administration that we've seen before this administration, the kind of statements that you see coming out of the president's mouth and out of the Secretary of State's mouth in terms of their high degree of confidence would have very much carried a message to all parties, the American people, foreign governments, that we must have pretty solid consensus of evidence to back that up. The problem is that we have seen a number of times in this administration where statements like that haven't been backed up by the facts. So I think there's a strong element of doubt out there. Ultimately, I think like we saw with the SARS outbreak in 2003, it's going to take the scientists to really come to some kind of consensus in this, and or an intelligence assessment backed up by evidence that can be pointed to and released publicly to really make the case.
So, Randy, how do the intelligence officers on the ground now in China, how do they get to the truth in a situation like this in a country like that?
Very difficult, very difficult. The job of intelligence obviously is to look at all sources of information, put them together, try to make sense of the trends that you're seeing, figure out where your gaps are, and try to fill them as best you can. It's almost never a 100% exercise. And so in this kind of situation, I would imagine, and I'm confident, that U.S. intelligence agencies, and there has been a lot of discussion in recent days about the Five Eyes, I'm sure that they are talking about it amongst themselves, that there are efforts to look at not only what is out in open source information, but what we may see from other types of intelligence, signals intelligence, human intelligence, to really be able to kind of get to a smoking gun scenario. The human source piece, I think, is the most important.
The other aspect of this, clearly, whatever the controversy of the lab, there is a track record of China not being forthright about problems that they want to keep hidden. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. And that's where the natural human instinct is to, and then they talk about generals always fighting the last war. I think human nature response is take a look at what we've seen before. And you have two recent outbreaks that were somewhat similar to this in the bird flu in 2009 and the SARS epidemic in 2003. And in both cases, most predominantly the SARS situation, there was a clear effort by the Chinese Communist Party to cover that up for a period of time and not reveal the truth, which really caused problems, obviously health-wise for its people, but also its reputation amongst the Chinese people themselves and around the world. And so the instinct was this must be going on again. Even among the Chinese people this time around, there was great concern back in January and February that this was going on. And certainly they've tried to work a bit since then to become a little more transparent, but there still are significant doubts in terms of the accuracy of the numbers that they've put out and their willingness to allow, whether it's the US, other countries, Australia, the UK, that have been arguing for this, to allow inspectors to come in and have an international review of exactly what happened here.
Talking with Randy Phillips, the former CIA country chief in China, there have been reports in the Washington Post and elsewhere that the CIA and the intelligence community provided details to President Trump back in January that this was perhaps coming. Is it really the kind of thing that the CIA and others track?
Absolutely. This is something that certainly I could speak to within the CIA for decades now. There have been certainly analytical units that have watched for this type of pandemic that would be a threat to health and security around the world, primarily to the US people. And so there's no doubt that there are analysts and collectors that are looking at this. That would have been one part of the feed that went to that National Security Council unit that was more or less disbanded in 2018. No doubt that this is a very important piece of collection, just given what we're seeing today in terms of the economic impact and the health and security of not only the American people, but the world.
You know, the president has been so critical of the intelligence community, sort of criticizing it when they give him information that he doesn't want to hear. That has to affect the performance of people in the field, doesn't it, when the president is not listening?
Absolutely. That's your customer number one is the president of the United States. And throughout my 28 years with the agency, and I know virtually all of my colleagues, when you were able to be involved with something that ended up on the president's desk, that was a significant achievement that you felt very proud of, because you knew you were doing something that really mattered. If the president is not consuming the intelligence or doesn't believe the intelligence, or in this case is speaking out very broadly about not trusting the intelligence, that absolutely has an impact on morale and probably a bit of a indirect feeling of how much effort you're going to make in terms of doing your job. I'm confident that the professionalism of the intelligence community has carried on despite all of this, but it definitely makes it hard.
It's hard enough, and then under any circumstances. How do CIA officers carry out their jobs in the middle of a pandemic when health is such at risk?
It's certainly tough, particularly for those whose job it is to go out and meet people and share information, try to find a way to fill in the blanks. When you're not able to meet in person, that takes away a certain element of just sort of human nature and trust that you're able to develop with people who might be able to tell you something that you'd like to know. So you end up having to do more indirect ways of reaching out to people, which can suffice to a point, but it's definitely not ideal.
And finally, do you think the CIA, the American intelligence community, will actually be able to get to the bottom of this and figure out where that virus actually came from?
I do. I'm confident that certainly the scientists will track this down. It may take longer, but the thoroughness of that will be very important. I think that I'm hopeful that the statements that came out from the Secretary of State and the President are backed up by a certain amount of evidence that may or may not have been shared with our Five Eyes partners. I'm confident that if it hasn't been, if there is such evidence, that it will be obtained, and there will be the ability to put together an assessment with a high degree of accuracy.
All right, Randy Phillips, I want to thank you so much. Randy is the former country chief for the CIA in China, and now with the Minsk Group, the senior partner in charge of the Asia operation. Again, Randy Phillips, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Rhonda.
All right, coming up, your questions about COVID-19 and the law, and questions about your pets. Is your dog at risk? We'll talk about it when we come back. You're watching the Law and Crime Trial Network.